The first 11 chapters of Genesis tell the story of the world, about how everything went from very good at the end of chapter 2 to rebellion and division at the end of chapter 11. Now, we noted that mankind was incapable of fixing the mess that they had made. In fact, from the moment of the fall, mankind was forced to find life in unregenerated flesh. And this flesh wants to act independently from God or from any other authority figure. I believe that man instinctively knew that there was something bigger than himself. And so he manufactured gods that would show him w- or that would allow him to do whatever he wanted to do with very little interference. And I find it fascinating that it didn't take long after the dispersal at Babel for regional gods to appear. Their names were different, but their function was the same. Every culture had gods for the elements, for crops to grow, and for fertility. I mean, even the system of worship was similar. And all these gods also allowed man to be distant and to do whatever he pleased. They demanded sacrifice, but not relationship. So next on digging deeper, I want to pick up the narrative 3 long generations after Babel. Mankind is spread across the planet, and some maintain their relationship with the one true God. But most of the people groups, had turned to follow other gods that were made in the image of man. Now, we know that God made creation good. And by one act of disobedience, man soiled the perfection. But God is still God. And so today will see how God is able to call one man from spoiled creation and through one act of obedience begin the process of redeeming creation and setting things right. Now, in order for no one to miss the importance of what God was doing, we find him repeating the process. On the first time, it was verbal, but the second time, it was more structured. So we find the first account in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, where it says, "And now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, um, which I believe are the most important 3 verses for the Israelites. For here, God called out one man out of the world, and he established a covenant with him. Now, this is the first and the only covenant that God makes with a specific people group that talks of his favor resting on them. And these 3 verses lay out the groundwork for the entire Old Testament. They talk about how and why God is going to do what he did. They even lay out the background for the present warring that we see in the Middle East today. So we need to get a firm handle on these 3 verses before we can move on with the rest of the Bible narrative. So we know that Abram was a man. He was a man of faith, even though he was far from perfect. And so as we look at his life and the wonderful things that he did, well, we don't want to forget how difficult it was for him. You see, Abram didn't grow up in a household of faith. Terah, Abram's father, served other gods. We read that in Joshua chapter 24, verse 2. And Abram grew up in Ur of the Chaldeans. And Ur was a very prosperous city, but it was also the capital of worship to Nannar, who was the Amun god and one of the highest gods in the Babylonian and the Sumerian pantheon. Now, Haran, which is where Abram's father moved the family, was also a seat of worship for Nannar. Now we know that Ur was sacked by the Guti shortly after Abram left. And the point that I want to make is that for Abram, it wasn't like being called to the mission field. That's not what it was like for him. In fact, it said he had no background for what God was going to ask of him. And so when we read, now the Lord said to Abram, we need to understand that Abram was learning something brand new. He was about to take a wild ride of faith. So I want to take a look at this covenant. What was it like? And what did it entail? And I think that will give us some clues as to why Abram did what he did. It says, now the Lord said to Abram, so Yahweh said, and again, remember, Abram's background was as a polytheist. His family worshipped many gods. There was no solid form of monotheism at this time, at least not in Ur. So Abram is going to completely change every part of his life because of this one encounter. Now, there's going to be tests and small steps as Abram learns what it means to trust this personal God. And Abram's walk with God is a progressive walk. In other words, he learns as he goes. And so Abram went from idolatry to monotheism, and he had to do it one step at a time. But it all began with a conversation. And the conversation that Yahweh had with Abram was, it says, Yahweh told Abram to do several things. He told him first to go, which is the imperative. And then he says, I want you to leave your country, your extended family, your immediate family, and go to a land that I will show you. So he was doing this, first of all, to get away from the influence of his family and of his home. And by doing this, Abram was aligning himself with Yahweh and he was forsaking Nannar. Don't miss that. That he was making an allegiance here. He was making an alliance, and I'm gonna align myself with Yahweh, and in doing so, he's turning his back on Nannar. And this was an intentional step for Abram, and it wasn't an easy one. But it's the one that God asks of every believer. In fact, Jesus told us that if we aren't willing to forsake mother, father, sisters, and brothers to follow him, then we aren't worthy of following. Because God expected a radical lifestyle change for Abram. And if Abram would do these things, leave his family, leave where he was, and go to a land that he would show him, then God was going to do some things. God was going to, first of all, he was going to make him into a great nation. That he's going to give him numerous descendants. We see that in chapter 13, verse 6, and again in 15, verse 5. He says that he would be the father of many nations. But the line from Isaac would be the one that would be the true lineage. We find that in 15, verse 4, and again in 21, verse 12. And then he says, then he also promises that the blessings of God would be on him. And this would be materially. We see this in 25, verses 35 and 36. And he would also have incredible military power. And Abram was. Abram was undefeated as a military man. And then the third thing is that he would have an enhanced reputation. And he says, basically, I'm going to turn you into a king. Now, this normally happens in battle. We see this in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 9. But Yahweh told Abram, this is what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to enhance your reputation among the people groups around you. In fact, we know that the Hethites called him a mighty prince in Genesis 23, verse 6. And now this promise was a very specific promise. It was in the form of a royal grant. Now, a royal grant was a covenant between a great king and a vassal king. And it was actually pretty common at the time of Abram, and in fact, even in Europe during the Middle Ages, this is where, for example, when William the Conqueror came over from Normandy and he came over into Britain, and when he won at the Battle of Hastings, that he appointed earls and dukes and so on. He gave out royal grants, and that so this was a fairly normal, or I should say, at least something that people knew about. But with that, there were four parts to this royal grant. First of all, there was a bestowal of kingship under the great king. We also know that it was in perpetuity. In other words, it could never be revoked. And then finally, it was given to, or the third thing is it was given to one and only one family. In other words, it couldn't be transferred. That he couldn't give it to to somebody that he liked. No, it was only in his family. And then the fourth thing that we know in a royal grant is that the blessings of this royal grant are only acquired through faithfulness. So the fact that you have it is something that one king gives to a vassal king that cannot be revoked. There's nothing that anybody could do to take it away. However, you'll only experience the blessings of this grant and of this covenant is if you're faithful. Now, the result of this covenant is found in the end of verse 2 and into verse 3. And he says, and so you shall be a blessing. So, in other words, that this put it in a way that Abram and his descendants would know that if they are faithful, God will do this. He will make them a channel of his blessing. So, God will bless the ones who bless him, Abram and his descendants. And he says, and to the one who curses you, I will curse. In other words, that there's individual responsibility here. It's not that each individual or those that would curse them or come up against them, God would work ultimately against them. And ultimately, the whole world will be blessed through you. Now, these things have happened, and they will continue to happen. This is the promise that God made that could not be taken away. Now, these are literal promises that God will keep. And Abram agreed to the conditions. In other words, he signed the contract when he took his family and he set off for the land of Canaan. So in Genesis chapter 12, verses 4 and 5, it tells us that so Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai his wife and Lot his brother's son, and all of their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, so things go pretty well for Abram and Canaan. We'll talk more about this and then this walk of faith over the next couple of podcasts. But even though he makes some mistakes, God still blesses him. Now, Abram understands the concept of the royal grant, but there's a problem. See, Abram has fulfilled his end of the bargain. I mean, he went into Canaan. He left everything and he went into Canaan. But it appears as though God is taking too much time fulfilling his end of the bargain. And so Abram has a verbal contract with God and he begins to question God about this. So let's pick up the story in Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 18, where it says, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, this man shall not be your heir. Your very own son will be your heir. And he brought him outside, and he said, look toward the heaven, toward the number of the stars, if you are able to count them. And then he said to him, so shall your offspring be. And he believed the Lord, and it counted to him as righteousness. And he said to him, I am the Lord who brought you up out of the Ur of the Chaldeans. I give you this land to possess. But he said, O Lord God, how am I to know that I am to possess it? And he said, bring me a heifer, 3 years old, a female goat, 3 years old, a ram, 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought them all. He cut them in half, and he laid each half over against each other, but he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, Abram drove them away. And the sun was setting down, and a deep sleep fell on Abram, and behold, dreadful and great darkness fell upon him. And then the Lord said to Abram, know for certain that your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs. There will be servants there, and they will be afflicted for 400 years. But I will bring judgment on the nation that they serve, and afterward they shall come out with great possessions. As for yourself, you shall go down to your fathers in peace. and you shall be buried in a good old age. And they shall come back here in the fourth generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. And when the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, to your offspring I give this land, from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river Euphrates. So God reiterates the royal grant with Abram, and he reminds him that God will make him into a great nation and that he will have descendants. And he put it in writing. Now we sign contracts, but they cut covenants. So here God cut a covenant, and he was the only signatory to this contract. So what this means is that there is nothing that Abram or those who come after him could do to break the contract because he didn't sign it. And the point for us is that the high point is the high point of this contract. That God would give Abram and his family land, that kings would come from Abram. This happened. And that may have been great for Abram and his family, but it doesn't really help us out. The thing that's important for us is the truth that God would bless the world through a specific seed of Abram. Now we know him as Jesus, our Messiah. So Jesus is coming. It's promised right here in Genesis chapter 12. Messiah is going to come. He was coming through the line of Abram, and God did this so that he would not be missed when he came. See, if Messiah does not come, then God is not God, because this is all about the faithfulness of God. And this was good news. This was good news for the world. God would make a way. He will reverse the curse of Genesis chapter 3. Now, God began to work, and he worked through one willing man. And we have seen this so far in our short period of looking at the history of humanity, that God can work, and he can change the world through one willing man. And now, over the next several sessions, we're going to look at how God raises up a people for himself. We'll also find that the people he chooses will not always rise to the standard that God has set, because they're living in the flesh. And we'll also see that God is able to fulfill his promises through sinful people. And all this stuff, I think, is good news. Now, remember how we finished last time? If something is going to be done, then God needs to do it. And the good news for us is that God did. So I hope that you're encouraged by these words. I hope that as we continue to look through the history of humanity, that you would be blessed. And don't forget to leave me a comment down below. Smash that notification bell, hit the subscribe button, share it with your friends, and have a wonderful time with your siblings in Christ as you worship the Lord. And I look forward to seeing you again in a future video. God bless you all.